No. Well, it's a pleasure to introduce you to Kirsten Nelson from Cambridge Tech, and she will go to talk about sequences over finite fields and method design.
Thanks. Yes, I'm Kirsten. I like to joke that Thais is my academic stepsister because her supervisor is married to my supervisor. I have a connection there. To make it clear, a student of Daniel at Carleton University, but I've left Carleton now and kind of a free agent, which I'll tell you about later. You might notice, but you're too polite to say that I'm a little old to be a student of Daniel. And that's one of the reasons I'm so fond of Daniel and Brett. They were both supervisors of mine because I decided to come back to school with more than 20 years after my undergraduate at the University of Waterloo. And I applied to a bunch of schools, all of whom said, no, thank you. But Carleton, Daniel, and Brett were willing to take a chance, and very grateful to them for that because we had a blast in Ottawa for many, many years. So I talked to Brett, and he said, don't focus on the math, focus on what you learned from Daniel. So this is one way of looking at what I learned from Daniel, but really this tells you nothing, right? Except that Carleton understands that Daniel should only teach topics courses. I was not an undergraduate when I saw you, so you know, you give them you give them a couple of words, you let them loose in a classroom with a bunch of grad students, and then it's great from there, right? So, but more seriously, these are kind of the three areas I picked out from those three courses to talk to you about. I think it must be a really tough job that supervisors have to do to come up with enough interesting problems to give their grad students that are difficult enough to be interesting and worthwhile, but easy enough to give you an entry point, especially when you come back to school after 20 years. And if I could not have told you what a finite field was when I walked back in through the doors at Carleton, which, by the way, somebody opened a door for me because they thought I was a professor. It's only after I was sitting in the classes with them that they figured it out and they stopped treating me with the little of respect they but in the very first class, it was topics in finite fields, and we talked about linear feedback shift registers, which are, you know, it's a recursive relation, so I felt like I was a little back on solid ground there. You treat it as you treat an equation, sorry, a polynomial as a recipe. You get some starting conditions, and then you see what comes out. What comes out is a sequence. Very simple one, and I'm using F3 right off the bat so that I don't forget to tell you that this is not just binary sequences, and it produces a sequence, and they're all periodic because these are finite fields. There's only so many things you can do before you start running out, so that makes things nice. When you start with a primitive polynomial, you get some really nice properties. It is periodic, like I said. They're balanced. The number of the number of elements in the sequence doesn't change by more than one element here or there. And you get this fun tuple property. So this one is binary over a period of 7. And if you want to look for the tuples, you can find them. Not 0, 0, 0, because that poor one gets left behind. 0, 0, 1 is here, 0, 1, 0, 1, 1, 1. And I put 2 periods because sometimes you have to look. You have to include the next period to find tuples. Oh, nice properties. I almost let this hang off because Daniel hates overflow H boxes.
Hold the paper between your nose.
Oh, yes. A red line on the margin. But so just for you, I put a break in it there, but I made sure it was one more. So our starting conditions, this is why the zeros are left out. If you start with your polynomial with all your starting values being 0, you're going to get 0 because these are all linear functions, which I might have forgot to say. So we must start to see repetition, but with a primitive polynomial, we don't see the repetition until we absolutely have to. So we've got long periods, very nice. This one is balanced, and we have all the times. And then Daniel said, outside of class in one of our first research meetings, he said, look at this, page 93 and signal design for good communication. Check out these interleaved sequences. So this is a sequence from the previous slide, but it's 63 long and I've put it in a 7x9, unless it's the 8x10 and I'm getting confused. Thank you, Chloe, for leaving typos in your presentation. I feel very good that all the math I'm talking about is solid because Daniel was involved, but Daniel had nothing to do with the talk or the present slides. All the mistakes are mine. But anyway, you wrap this around. Every column is another of these beautiful sequences. They're shifted up and down, but they're all the same sequence. If you look at the proof, and it has to do with the trace and the character sums, and it's no less beautiful when you know why it happens, which is one thing I like. And then you can, there's a base sequence. This must be the 8x10. And so this came from Games in 1985. You look at the top column and you look at each of the rows. And if the column is all zeros, we put an infinity in there. This is just a nice way of collapsing the sequence down into the shorter sequence and the row across the top. And the row across the top, what we're recording is just how much the sequence had to be shifted up to make it what it is. So we get this fun thing, which I put in square brackets, so I remember that it's the shift sequence, not the whole sequence itself. Now, technically, Games call the whole thing a shift sequence, but you don't get any benefit from, I like the idea. Instead of recording the whole matrix, you can just record a row and a column and you've got the whole thing. When matrices get big, that might be a useful thing. So there's just another example. Prove that I can do a subscript of subscript. That's basically all I did in my master's thesis, subscripts and subscripts. So it was fine. This is where we leave finite fields behind because Daniel suggested, we're decomposing these M sequences into interleaved sequences. What if we build them up? What if you have a sequence you like that maybe comes from polynomial, maybe it doesn't? Take an arbitrary column, an arbitrary shift sequence. What happens then? If the column you like, that original column has nice properties, does the big sequence also have those nice properties? Nobody knows unless you do research. Right? So, and does the shift sequence matter? Does any old shift sequence work? Oh yeah, I wanted to tell you something about that first. Not about that. I'm the first my dad was the first person in my family to do anything past high school. I was the first one to do a master's, so I didn't know. I got my information from books, and I think I read some novel where someone invited their supervisor over for dinner. So around the time of our first exams, Mike and I invited Daniel and Brett over for dinner, and I imagined some awkward, sedate little dinner party. Well, of course it wasn't. It was so much more than that. Daniel and Lucy and Diego and Lucas and Brett and Joelle and Greta. And next thing you know, Brett's turning the music up. The kids are trying to figure out what game to play. Daniel's making caipirinhas. Caipirinhas. I drank too many of them, and it just will not sink in. Our tiny little student apartment, he's making cocktails in the kitchen, and around 10 o'clock when I'd normally be going to bed, we're opening another 2 bottles of wine. It was not at all what I expected. And those epic parties continued until COVID came along and said, no, that's not what you should be doing with your time. It's too bad. Anyway. But then in the second term, we got into covering arrays and combinatorial designs. And this is where my time in industry, I feel, did help a little bit because I was in software development. And a covering array, as it turns out, and many of you know, it's a matrix, and by K array, it has this property that if you take any T columns, it's kind of similar to that tuple property. You take any T columns, you'll see every possible tuple. So I just took one from the internet and plugged in some possible ideas for if you were testing a piece of software that had different databases, different browsers, different, you'd have to test all these combinations. Exhaustive testing would, of course, be 16 setups you would have to do. But if you suspect that pairwise interactions are going to be your main problem, this will cover all of them in 5 tests. And this is an example of the software I worked on at IBM. The number of tests we would have had to do was almost 500,000. In theory, in practice, of course, what IBM does is they set up 5 configurations corresponding to the clients who spent the most money on the software, and that's what they test. The rest of you can call the support line, we can't hear you. But it looks great in the presentation, right? In the justification section here. And then the notion of epsilon almost covering arrays, because this is how it links back to these sequences. These sequences that have the tuple property tend to have good but not great coverage. So you can put them into an array like this, and they won't necessarily cover everything the way you want. So I'm missing 1 pair of columns here. So 5 out of 6, 2 sets are covered. But we've saved ourselves 1 out of 5 tests. So if the ratio of tests you save is bigger than the number of columns you're missing, maybe this is okay in industry. Maybe someone who uses Microsoft as their web server is going to use Microsoft Active Directory as their directory server, and it's okay to have some, not so great randomness among a pair of columns. So I can see applications for these epsilon almost covering this. Feels like it's time for a story. Maybe not. Think of anything right at the moment. So yeah, another example. So this is the sequence from before, one of them anyway, 7 long. And oh yeah, that's right. I wanted to illustrate what I meant by turning it into an array. You just keep taking shifts of the sequence and stick them in, put a row of zeros at the top because of course zeros that always get left behind. Our epsilon here is 0.2 because 0.2 is the ratio of tests that are missing, but we would have to have 12 rows instead of 8 for full 3 coverage. So we saved 1/3 of the tests for only dropping 2/10 of 1/5 of the coverage. Maybe that's it. And then I have to admit, I couldn't remember when I went back and looked at the abstract why I wanted to talk about the Turan graph, except that I really like graph theories in undergrad, because many undergrads do. Proof by picture is a wonderful thing when you're an inexperienced mathematician. Daniel steered me away from that. But this was a picture I made for the 3rd course where we had to do our projects. And I do think, more seriously, it illustrates how, this was a course that used proofs from the book as a textbook. I had done a class like that in my undergraduate degree. Didn't really grab me. But I would come home from this class. First of all, I didn't know I needed 7 proofs if there's an infinite number of primes in my life, but I did. And I would come home and I would say to Mike, I got to show you this cool thing we did today. And he nod politely, being an engineer, kind of he along for the ride.
I should teach you this course again. It's so much fun, right?
It was so much fun.
75 proofs
Yeah.
of the infinite of primes.
Yeah, I don't think Daniel knows the meaning of the phrase phone it in, by the way. If you've never had the pleasure of a class with him, like every class, he's bouncing and yeah. So you don't even have to have him as your supervisor, just as a student. He's a fun guy. That's a Brett joke, actually. But there is a connection. The Turan number, the number of edges on the graph and T vertices with no G cleats can be gives you a bound for the covering array, which I didn't explain very well. The maximum number of rows of tests, if you will, that you need to do all your coverage is the covering array number. And that's it's not a trivial thing to figure out for most sets of parameters. Yeah, so eventually I did manage to get my master's. Some happy looking people there. And I don't know why I don't look happy. I was thrilled, but I don't think I slept the night before. That may be true of all master's students. So thank you, Lucia. Stephen. Thank you, guy on the far right, whose name I can't remember.
That was.
That's right now. And that's what my thesis ended up being on, was these properties of interleaved sequences. So when you have an M sequence, specifically these nice sequences, what does the interleaved sequence inherit and what doesn't it? Was a fun time. And application came out of it. So I do remember one time turning to see Daniel and saying out of the blue, like, what's your AirDosh number? So it is 1.
Oh, no.
Two, it is 2. That's right, yes.
I didn't have
I
time.
clearly do not remember that well. So it's going to call into question my final story, but anyway, it means my AirDosh number is 3, you know? I'm very pleased about it. I'm sorry, but it's about Daniel. So, and I got to go to England 1 or 2 summers ago to present that. So that was nice. But I haven't even scratched the surface of the interesting properties of these, because in that same games paper, once I understood what I was reading, these shift sequences, when you decompose an M sequence into the interleave, they have this interesting property where when you look at the difference between the elements, and kind of, these are all taken mod, whatever S is in your thing, you get all the possible differences. So we thought, aha, this is probably important. Turns out it is. So we came up with a strength T analog of it, because it's easy if you have two columns in a array. It's easy to think about 3 columns and look at the tuples. It's a little harder to look at the differences, but we managed to come up with a definition we liked, and we called it the different separation property of strength T. Naming things is harder than I realized it was going to be. And so just to prove that these things actually exist, here's one. It's quite a bit longer than I would like, but these things are not that easy to find. And interestingly, again, one of the benefits of having Daniel in your life is that you have Lucy in your life, if you're listening. Courses with Lucy at University of Ottawa. And this came from a heuristic program that I wrote in Lucy's class for a project. So it's a nice, interplay between the things I was learning between the adults in my life. And one of the fun things we've managed to convince ourselves of is that if you believe these shift sequences are important, they do actually exist. Well, as long as big T is big enough, and we do need to assume the Riemann hypothesis, which is not something I ever thought I would be doing in combinatorics, but there we go. And it turns out this property, this different separation property, it is key to inheriting coverage. For a nice sequence you like, if it has good coverage, you can pick a bad shift sequence that will absolutely annihilate coverage. You're not guaranteed to have as good coverage in a long sequence as you had in the short sequence if you don't know how to pick a good shift. So, but these are some of the things we've managed to prove. I think this is quite cool actually. If your short sequence only has the 3 tuple property, you can get a lot, not defining a lot, of 3 coverage in the interleaved sequence, as long as you choose a good shift sequence. And it fails in places where the column, where entries are stacked on top of each other. And it makes sense when you kind of get looking at it. But if your base sequence has 3 coverage, then your interleaved sequence will have 3 coverage. No caveats necessary. So it inherits quite nicely there. And so those are things that I'm sort of in theory working on, although I did leave Carleton. Daniel's been very generous with his time, and I think the last meeting I looked at my calendar was February of 2023. So we've been still working together through COVID over Zoom. My home is an 8-hour drive from Ottawa. So we are not in Ottawa very often. We continued working, 3 of us on Zoom. And this is where I work now. So Kenji Tang. My students, I teach math for the trades. So my students don't go on to become researchers and professors. They become carpenters, welders, and they will come fix my roof if I need them to, which is wonderful. And it gives me a lot of release time to do what I want, which is very often talk to Daniel. So this is me in the wood shop. I made this with my students. We were doing this. And then if it's not clear, you tell me that this outside the window is winter. Is it clear to everyone here that I'm standing on a lake? That is frozen water that's 40 centimeters, 40 centimeters deep. We cut a hole in with a chainsaw, and we're now fishing, setting a net under that ice. So that is the coldest I was all last winter. But this is me at work. They paid me to be there to do this with my students because it's an Indigenous organization. We give back to the land. And I do feel sometimes like as a math teacher, I have the furthest distance to go to get to the land with my students. Like, how am I going to turn trigonometry into something land-based? But I find it extremely fun. And so in the language, I'd like to say, Chini Wetch, thank you very much. Thank you thank the organizers for your support. And Daniel, muito obrigado. Okay, good, thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Yes.
Spanish.
Yeah. Gracias. For being supervisor, mentor, friend, I'm extremely grateful. Great.
Do we have any questions?
Right. That part.
So we have some students that are interested in cryptography here. And I remember that in one of your talks, you mentioned the applications of sequences in cryptography. Do you remember that?
Yeah, there's some pseudo randomness that, but I think I've seen some references in the past few days to that not being kind of strong enough for what's generally needed these days with cryptography. Is that right?
So it depends. Yeah, you can use sequences, but there are these measures, actually measures that Arne Winterhoff was talking. And with those measures, you can eliminate a lot of the sequences. To start, they have to be non-linear. If they are linear, oh. And so it eliminates a lot of easy. But yeah, they come from sequences, but not linear.
I see.
And it's the linearity that causes a failure in the columns, because some of the columns are related to each other in a linear fashion. So I do think there could be some interesting actions there.
Any questions? No? Let's thank first.
Right now is great.
No, break. Next talk is at 3.
Okay. Oh, no coffee.
So we have an 8-minute break.
Ah, o dinheiro? Não tanto a prática, mas eu vegetais. Vai. Que às vezes eu fico vai fazendo uma tal você não falar estoques com 10 pessoas, né?
Tem alguma coisa.
Eu não sei como tirar o volumen do WhatsApp.
Oi?
Eu não sei como tirar o volumen do WhatsApp, porque aqui estava sem volume.
Ah, que,
Entrou, foi chamada de ligação de WhatsApp, né?
aham,
Me ligaram aqui da secretaria. Eu, que me liga se eu estou em conferência?
aham.
Eu também estou em obra, tá? Tem uma obra que está correndo aí no terceiro andar. Tem uma obra que hay, obra de uma sala que estamos reformando. Un nuevo laboratorio llama. Es de esencialmente educación matemática, ¿no? Laboratorio de cine matemática. Montando un laboratorio nuevo por acá. Ya te inventas cosas, ¿no? Inventa.
Entrou, então ele conseguiu entrar, né?
Sí, él entró.
Entrou e saiu.
No sé si está aquí ainda. Gabriel está ahí. Aquí.
Ainda está.
Eso desligó acá.
Esse tem alguma mensagem de alguém.
Yo creo que un moderador debe ser fácil conectar, ¿no? Espero.
Vamos ver.
Él le molesta mucho Queen.
Exatamente na universidade. Rodrigo. Não, é outra, o TFP. É o campus. Esse
Pato Branco.
É o Rodrigo. E esse é Pato Branco.
Não,
Ela tá em Santa...
O Rodrigo é o meu namorado. Não, você tá pensando, eu estou grande, tá cegado.